Unaware his wife was the secret daughter of a trillionaire who owned the company he worked for, Derek Morrison signed the divorce papers with a satisfied smirk, his mistress Vanessa clinging to his arm in their modest apartment where his wife had paid most of the bills for 5 years. But what Derek didn't know as he handed those papers to his soon-to-be ex-wife Emma was that she had just received a private call from attorneys informing her of her biological father's passing and her inheritance of $350 million, making her one of the wealthiest women in the state overnight. His wife had always been quiet about her past, claiming she was an orphan raised in foster care. But the truth was far more complex. She had been secretly placed for adoption by tech trillionaire Victor Whitmore, founder and owner of Whitmore Technologies, the very company where Derek worked as a senior project manager and had met Vanessa, his ambitious secretary, who had convinced him his wife was holding him back from greatness. Emma had spent years supporting Derek's career, putting him through his MBA, networking for his promotions, and managing their household while working remotely as a freelance consultant. But he had grown distant after Vanessa started at Whitmore Technologies, complaining that Emma lacked sophistication and ambition despite her being the foundation of everything he had achieved. The divorce papers Derek had just served her included demands for half of their shared savings, money Emma had mostly contributed, and custody arrangements for their apartment lease. But nowhere in those papers did Derek account for the fact that his wife would soon control the very company that employed him, the board of directors already preparing to meet with her as the late Victor Whitmore's sole heir and new majority shareholder. Vanessa, who had orchestrated this entire divorce by feeding Derek's insecurities and promising him a life of passion and success she claimed Emma couldn't provide, stood in the apartment wearing expensive jewelry she'd charged to credit cards she expected Derek to pay off. But she had no idea that Emma's inheritance included not just liquid assets but controlling interest in a tech empire valued at $12 billion. As Emma quietly packed her belongings in the bedroom, she held the attorney's letter in her trembling hands, her mind reeling from the revelation that the man who had abandoned her as an infant out of fear of public scandal had watched over her from afar her entire life, ensuring she received an excellent education through scholarships and grants that were actually his doing, but never revealing himself until this moment when death forced the truth into the light. Derek, meanwhile, was already planning his future with Vanessa, talking about the promotion he expected, the house they would buy, and the expensive honeymoon they would take, but he remained completely unaware that his soon-to-be ex-wife now possessed the power to reshape his entire existence with a single phone call to the executive board. The question wasn't whether Emma would reveal her identity and use her newfound power, but how devastating her response would be when Derek finally learned the truth about who his wife really was, what he had thrown away, and how thoroughly he had destroyed his own future. Would Emma expose Derek's affair to the company's ethics board and watch his career crumble? Would she use her position as the company's new owner to show him exactly how much power the woman he deemed unsophisticated actually wielded? And would Vanessa remain by Derek's side when she discovered that the man she had manipulated into divorce had just walked away from a connection to unimaginable wealth and influence? The apartment was silent except for the sound of Emma's suitcase zipper closing, but Derek didn't notice because he was too busy texting Vanessa about dinner reservations to celebrate their freedom. Emma Whitmore, she would reclaim that name soon enough, stood in the bedroom doorway holding a single cardboard box containing 5 years of memories that Derek had already dismissed as worthless. But what she actually carried was the weight of a secret that would detonate both their lives within days. The divorce papers on the kitchen counter bore Derek Morrison's aggressive signature, the ink still wet from where he'd signed with flourish, but they also bore Emma's careful, measured signature that she'd added only after reading the attorney's letter 3 times, each reading making the irony deeper and more profound. Derek scrolled through his phone, his back to Emma, his mind already in the future he'd planned with Vanessa. But if he had turned around, he might have noticed the way Emma's hands no longer trembled, the way her shoulders had straightened, the way something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. She wasn't the broken woman he expected her to be, but Derek wouldn't realize this until it was far too late. "I'll be out by tonight," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Derek glanced up briefly, his expression showing relief rather than regret, but he failed to recognize that Emma's calmness wasn't defeat. It was the eye of a hurricane gathering strength. "Probably for the best," he muttered, returning to his phone. "Vanessa says we should put this place on the market fast. Fresh start and all that." Emma nodded slowly, but she was calculating timelines, legal procedures, and the various ways a person's world could collapse when they discovered they'd betrayed someone who now controlled their professional destiny. "The apartment's in my name," she reminded him, her tone still even. "The lease, the deposit, everything." Derek waved dismissively, but his cavalier attitude revealed how little attention he'd paid to the practical details of their life together. "We'll figure it out. You can buy me out or whatever." Buy him out? Emma almost laughed at the absurdity, but she maintained her composure, her mind already 3 steps ahead of this conversation. The attorney's letter had been clear. She had 72 hours to claim her inheritance, sign the necessary documents, and assume her position on the board of directors at Whitmore Technologies. But Derek didn't know that in 72 hours, his entire world would transform in ways his limited imagination couldn't fathom. The backstory Emma had maintained for years, orphan, foster care, community college on grants, had been carefully constructed to protect her from exactly the kind of opportunistic attention that wealth attracted. But it had also been a test, one that Derek had failed spectacularly. Victor Whitmore had placed her for adoption 30 years ago, when his wife, threatened by an affair that had produced a child, had given him an ultimatum: the child or the marriage. But he had chosen his marriage and his company's reputation, while ensuring through anonymous trusts and foundations that his daughter received everything she needed: education, opportunities, safety, from a distance that tore at him for 3 decades. Emma had discovered pieces of this truth over the years through inconsistencies in her adoption paperwork and scholarships that seemed too perfectly timed, but she had never pursued the full story, perhaps afraid of what she might find. But Victor Whitmore's death had forced the revelation, his final act of courage or cowardice being to give her everything he'd built, while explaining through a letter why he'd never had the strength to claim her publicly as his daughter. Derek's phone buzzed with another text from Vanessa, and his face lit up with the kind of excitement he hadn't shown Emma in years. But that enthusiasm was built on foundations of sand that would collapse the moment truth's tide came in. Vanessa found a great restaurant for tonight, that new place downtown, the expensive one. Celebration dinner. Celebrating what exactly? Emma asked, though she knew the answer. Our future, Derek said, finally looking at her directly, but his gaze held no guilt, no recognition of the devastation he was causing. Look, Emma, you're a good person, but we both know this marriage has been dead for a while. Vanessa makes me feel alive. She understands ambition. She gets the corporate world in ways you never could. The irony was so profound that Emma had to bite her lip to keep from revealing everything right then, but she knew that patience would make the revelation infinitely more impactful. Vanessa, who worked as Derek's secretary at Whitmore Technologies, had indeed understood the corporate world. She understood how to manipulate insecure men, how to identify targets, and how to position herself for maximum advantage. But Vanessa had made one catastrophic miscalculation. She had assumed Emma was exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet woman with no connections and no power. "I hope she makes you happy," Emma said, and she meant it in the most complicated way possible. Derek seemed satisfied with this response, interpreting her grace as acceptance rather than strategy, but he had never been particularly skilled at reading subtext or understanding that people often contain multitudes beneath their surface presentations. He returned to his phone, already mentally checked out of this conversation and this chapter of his life. Emma picked up her box and walked toward the door, but she paused at the threshold, looking back at the apartment where she'd built a life with a man who had ultimately valued her so little that he'd traded her for a woman who'd manipulated him with practiced precision. The furniture was mostly hers, purchased with her money, but she would leave it all because where she was going, she wouldn't need any of these modest possessions. "Derek," she said, her voice carrying a weight he didn't recognize, "do you remember when we met? I asked you what success meant to you." He looked up, confused by this sudden detour into memory, but he answered automatically. "Building something meaningful, making a difference, being recognized for my work." "And you feel like you're achieving that at Whitmore Technologies?" "I'm getting there," Derek said, his chest puffing slightly with pride. "The promotion I'm expecting will put me on the executive track. Regional Vice President, corner office, the works. Vanessa's been incredible at helping me position myself for it." Emma nodded slowly, committing this moment to memory, but she was also noting every detail for the conversation she would have with the board of directors in exactly 68 hours. "I hope you get everything you deserve," she said, and the double meaning sailed completely over Derek's head. She walked out, closing the door with a soft click that Derek barely registered, but that sound marked the end of one existence and the violent beginning of another. Emma descended the stairs of the apartment building, emerged onto the street, and stood for a moment in the afternoon sunlight, feeling the warmth on her face while holding a letter from a dead father she'd never known and divorce papers from a husband who'd never truly seen her. Her phone rang. The attorney, Robert Carmichael, his voice professionally sympathetic but also urgent with legal timelines and procedural necessities. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, using her birth name for the first time in her life. "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to begin the process. The board is expecting you Monday morning. The announcement will go public Tuesday. The media will be intense." "I understand," Emma said, her voice clearer than it had been in years. "There are also some complications you should be aware of regarding Whitmore Technologies' current employees. As the new majority shareholder, you'll have access to all personnel files, performance reviews, and active HR investigations. Some situations may require your immediate attention." Emma's mind flashed to Derek, to Vanessa, to the small empires people built within larger empires, but she pushed those thoughts aside for the moment. "Mr. Carmichael, I need you to do something for me. I need complete confidentiality maintained until Tuesday's public announcement. No leaks, no rumors. No one at Whitmore Technologies can know about my identity or my relationship to Victor Whitmore until the official reveal." There was a pause on the line, but then Carmichael's tone shifted to something almost appreciative. "You have a plan." "I have questions that need honest answers," Emma corrected, but she was also forming a plan, one that would reveal exactly who Derek and Vanessa truly were when they thought no one of consequence was watching. "And I need to see how certain people behave when they believe there are no consequences." "Understood. The board meeting is scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. I'll have a car pick you up at 8. We have much to discuss before then. Your father's estate, the company's current projects, strategic priorities, and your vision for leadership." Emma ended the call and looked up at the apartment building where Derek was undoubtedly still texting Vanessa about celebrations and futures built on the rubble of broken promises, but neither of them understood yet that they had demolished their own foundations, not hers. She walked to her car, a 10-year-old sedan she'd maintained meticulously, and drove toward a future that neither she nor Derek could have imagined when they'd met at a coffee shop 7 years ago, back when she'd been enchanted by his ambition and he'd been drawn to her stability. The backstory of their relationship played through Emma's mind as she drove. They'd met when she was 23, working as a freelance business consultant while finishing her degree in organizational management, a degree paid for by one of Victor Whitmore's anonymous foundations, though she hadn't known it then. Derek had been 25, newly hired at Whitmore Technologies as a junior analyst, full of dreams and hunger that Emma had found attractive because it suggested someone who wanted to build something meaningful. Their courtship had been sweet but unremarkable, filled with cheap dinners and long walks and conversations about futures they would build together, but Emma now recognized that Derek had always been more in love with the idea of success than with her, specifically. She had supported his MBA, both financially and emotionally, while he studied nights and weekends. She had networked at company events, making connections that benefited his career. She had managed their household so completely that Derek could focus entirely on climbing the corporate ladder. But somewhere around year 3, Derek had started viewing her contributions as obligations rather than gifts, her support as expectations rather than choices. By year 4, he'd begun making comments about her lack of corporate ambition, her preference for remote work, her contentment with their modest lifestyle. By year 5, Vanessa had started at Whitmore Technologies, and Derek had found someone who reflected back to him a more exciting version of himself. Emma pulled into the parking lot of a hotel. She would need somewhere to stay while she figured out her next steps, and sat in her car for a long moment, processing the seismic shifts of the past 6 hours. This morning she'd been Emma Morrison, quiet wife of an ambitious corporate climber, contemplating a divorce that would leave her with half of very little. But tonight she was Emma Whitmore, daughter of a trillionaire, heir to a tech empire, an unknowing puppet master of the man who'd just discarded her. The letter from Victor Whitmore lay on the passenger seat, and Emma picked it up again, reading her father's words for the 4th time. His handwriting was precise but shaky. Illness had taken him quickly, and his words carried the weight of 3 decades of regret. "Emma, I have failed you in every way a father can fail a daughter, except one. I ensured you would never want for opportunity, even if you could never know where that opportunity came from. I was a coward. I chose reputation over relationship, image over integrity, comfort over courage. I told myself I was protecting you from the burden of my public life, but the truth is I was protecting myself from the inconvenience of public scandal. Your mother, your birth mother, was a brilliant engineer who worked for my company. What we shared was real, but I was married, and when you were conceived, I was given a choice by my wife. Abandon you or lose everything I'd built. I chose my company, I chose my marriage, I chose everything except you, and I have lived with that shame every day since. But I watched you, Emma, from a distance, always from a distance. I saw you excel in school on scholarships I quietly funded. I saw you graduate with honors from a university whose endowment I significantly increased the year you applied. I saw you build a career and a life with grace and integrity that I never possessed. I saw you marry a man who works for my company, and I have watched with growing concern as that man has taken you for granted, in ways that mirror my own moral failures. Now I am dying, and cowardice no longer serves any purpose. This letter accompanies legal documents that make you the sole heir to my estate and the majority shareholder of Whitmore Technologies. You will own controlling interest in a company valued at $12 billion. You will inherit liquid assets exceeding $350 million. You will have power, influence, and resources beyond anything you could have imagined. I do not deserve your forgiveness. I do not deserve to be called your father, but I hope that what I leave you can somehow compensate for what I took from you. The right to know where you came from, who you belonged to, and that you were wanted, even if I lacked the courage to show it. Be stronger than I was, Emma. Be braver, and build something better with what I'm giving you than I ever managed to build alone. Victor Whitmore. Emma folded the letter carefully, her eyes dry, but her heart a complicated knot of emotions she would need time to untangle. Victor Whitmore had given her everything except himself, a gift so enormous and so hollow that she didn't know whether to feel grateful or furious. But one thing was certain: she would not waste this opportunity to discover what Derek and Vanessa were truly made of when they thought no one powerful was watching. Monday morning arrived with the crisp professionalism of a new season, but Derek Morrison moved through his routine with unusual energy, his mind already at the celebration dinner from Friday night, where Vanessa had been particularly attentive and enthusiastic about their future together. He'd spent the weekend moving his belongings from the apartment Emma had vacated. She'd left everything, which he'd found odd but convenient, into Vanessa's place, a trendy loft she claimed she could barely afford on her secretary's salary, but somehow maintained with designer furniture and expensive art. The morning commute to Whitmore Technologies took Derek through the city's corporate corridor, tall glass buildings reflecting morning sun and ambition in equal measure. But he didn't notice the unusual number of luxury vehicles in the executive parking garage or the clusters of senior management arriving earlier than usual. Something was happening at the highest levels of the company, but Derek's focus remained on his expected promotion, the one Vanessa had assured him was definitely coming, based on her access to executive communications. Derek's office was modest but respectable, the space of a senior project manager who'd steadily climbed without quite breaking through to executive status, and he settled into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to leap to the next level. His computer hummed to life, and he began reviewing the project status reports that would be part of this week's executive briefing, the briefing where he believed his promotion would be announced. Vanessa appeared in his doorway at 8:30, her professional attire carefully calculated to suggest competence while maintaining the allure that had initially caught Derek's attention, but her expression carried unusual tension. "Have you heard anything about today's board meeting?" she asked, her voice low. Derek shook his head, but he felt a flutter of anticipation because board meetings often preceded significant company announcements. "Is it about the Q4 earnings, the investor calls?" "No one knows," Vanessa said, moving closer and dropping her voice further. "But every C-suite executive is here, and I saw Robert Carmichael from legal arriving with someone in a private car, young woman, 30s maybe. They went straight to the executive floor." "New hire," Derek suggested, though his mind was already spinning through possibilities. "Maybe," Vanessa said, but her eyes held calculation that Derek had learned to recognize as her strategic mind processing information. "Or maybe it's about the ownership transition. Victor Whitmore's death was 2 months ago, and there have been rumors about his estate, about who inherits what." Derek's interest sharpened, but not with concern. He didn't yet understand how any of this could possibly connect to his personal life. "Whitmore had kids?" "Not publicly," Vanessa said, her tone suggesting she'd researched this thoroughly. But rich men always have secrets, and whoever inherits will have majority control. 51% stake. They'll effectively own everything. So we might have a new boss, Derek said, finding this interesting but not particularly relevant to his immediate concerns. As long as they don't restructure before my promotion comes through, I don't really care. Vanessa nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful in ways Derek didn't fully process because he had never quite understood that Vanessa's interest in him was directly proportional to his perceived value and positioning, not to any genuine connection. She had assessed Derek as a rising prospect when she'd targeted him, a man positioned for executive advancement who could be manipulated through his insecurities about his wife and his marriage. But if Derek's trajectory changed, so would Vanessa's loyalty. The morning progressed with unusual undercurrents throughout the building, whispers and speculation flowing through departments like electrical currents. But Derek remained focused on his work, confident in his position and blind to the gathering storm. At 11 a.m., an all-staff email arrived. Company-wide announcement tomorrow at 10 a.m. Attendance mandatory, details to follow. Derek's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "This is big. Something major is happening." He texted back, "Maybe the new owner wants to introduce themselves. Put on a good show." But Derek's casual confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced, because while he prepared for a promotion he believed was inevitable, Emma Whitmore sat in the executive boardroom listening to Robert Carmichael present the legal framework of her inheritance, while 8 senior directors absorbed the shock that their late founder's secret daughter was now their majority shareholder and, effectively, their boss. Emma had spent the weekend in intensive briefings, company financials, strategic initiatives, personnel challenges, competitive landscape, and what she'd learned had sharpened her understanding of exactly where Derek and Vanessa fit in the corporate ecosystem. Derek was competent but not exceptional, his advancement aided significantly by Emma's networking and support rather than by pure merit. Vanessa was flagged in HR notes as politically savvy and ambitious, euphemisms that suggested she was skilled at manipulation but carefully avoided crossing lines that would trigger formal complaints. "The announcement tomorrow will shock the organization," said Margaret Torres, the CFO, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that had been assessing Emma since she'd walked into the room. "Victor kept this secret for 30 years. People will have questions. The media will be intense." "I understand," Emma said, her voice calm but carrying authority that surprised even her. "But I'm not interested in making this about personal drama or family secrets. I'm interested in understanding this company, its people, and where it's heading." James Kirkland, the COO, leaned forward with the kind of direct intensity that suggested he appreciated straight talk. "Ms. Whitmore, you now control 51% of a company worth $12 billion, but you've never worked in corporate technology. What are your intentions?" Emma had anticipated this question, and her answer was both honest and strategic. "My intentions are to learn, listen, and understand what my father built before making any significant changes. But I'm not a figurehead, and I'm not interested in being managed or handled. I will be actively involved in understanding every aspect of this company, including its culture, its challenges, and its people." The room absorbed this, but Emma noticed Margaret Torres nodding slightly with what might have been approval. "There are some personnel situations you should be aware of," Margaret said carefully. "Relationships between employees, potential conflicts of interest, situations that haven't quite crossed the line into HR violations but exist in gray areas." Emma's expression remained neutral, but her pulse quickened slightly. "Such as?" Margaret glanced at a tablet, then back at Emma. Derek Morrison, senior project manager, recently divorced, currently in a relationship with Vanessa Hartley, his secretary. The relationship began approximately 6 months ago, while Mr. Morrison was still married. There have been some concerns about preferential treatment, about Ms. Hartley's access to confidential information, and about Mr. Morrison's judgment. The room went very quiet, but if anyone noticed the slight tightening around Emma's eyes, they didn't comment on it. Robert Carmichael, who knew Emma's connection to Derek, watched her carefully, but Emma's voice remained steady when she spoke. "What actions have been taken?" "The situation has been monitored but not formally addressed," Margaret said. "The affair wasn't technically a policy violation, since Ms. Hartley reports to Mr. Morrison willingly, and she's never filed a complaint. But there have been questions about Mr. Morrison's promotion recommendations for Ms. Hartley, about his access to executive communications through her, and about his recent divorce timing." "I see," Emma said, and she did see. She saw everything with a clarity that 3 days of revelation had provided. "Are there other situations like this?" "A few," James Kirkland admitted. "We're a large company. These things happen. The question is how the new leadership wants to handle them." Emma considered this carefully, weighing vengeance against integrity, personal hurt against professional responsibility, but her answer came from a place of principle that Derek had never properly recognized in her. "I want a full review of all personnel situations that exist in gray areas, not witch hunts, not purges, but honest assessments of whether people are being advanced on merit or manipulation, whether relationships are genuine or strategic, and whether our culture supports integrity or just cleverness." The executives exchanged glances that suggested Emma had just passed some kind of test, but she wasn't finished. "I also want to understand our performance review processes. How do we evaluate people? What metrics matter? And how do we ensure that advancement is based on actual contribution rather than proximity to power?" "That's a comprehensive review," Margaret said, but her tone suggested respect rather than resistance. "It will take time." "We have time," Emma said, "but I want to start with transparency. Tomorrow's announcement needs to be honest about who I am, where I came from, and what my presence means for this company's future, and then I want to spend the next several weeks understanding this organization from the ground up." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering financial details, strategic priorities, and the practical realities of Emma's new position. But when it finally concluded, Emma remained in the boardroom with Robert Carmichael, while the executives filed out. "You handled that well," Carmichael said once they were alone. "I told the truth," Emma replied. "That's not handling, that's just honesty." "Honesty can be radical in corporate environments," Carmichael observed. "But regarding Derek Morrison and Vanessa Hartley, what do you want to do?" Emma walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the view from the executive floor revealing the scope of what she now controlled. But her mind was on the man who divorced her days ago, without knowing any of this existed. "I want to do nothing," she said finally. "I want to watch what they do when tomorrow's announcement happens. I want to see how they react, what choices they make, and who they really are when they think no one who matters is watching." "That's a test," Carmichael said. "It's an observation," Emma corrected. "Derek and Vanessa made choices based on what they thought I was worth, what they thought I could offer, and what they thought they deserved. Tomorrow they'll learn information that would have changed those calculations, but by then, the choices will already be made, and we'll all know exactly what kind of people they are." Carmichael nodded slowly, but his expression held concern. "And if what you observe confirms your worst suspicions about their characters, then I'll make decisions about this company's culture and standards based on principle, not revenge," Emma said firmly. But I won't protect people who built their advancement on manipulation and betrayal. That's not revenge. That's accountability. Emma left Whitmore Technologies that afternoon through a private exit, her identity still protected for one more day. But as she drove back to the hotel where she'd been staying, her mind played through scenarios of tomorrow's revelation. Derek would be in that room. Vanessa would be in that room. They would hear Emma's name, see her face, and in a single moment understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. But Emma's plans extended beyond that moment of shock, because what she wanted wasn't Derek's humiliation. It was his confrontation with the reality of who he'd become, what he'd valued and what he'd destroyed in pursuit of ambitions built on sand rather than substance. Tuesday morning began with unusual electricity throughout Whitmore Technologies, the mandatory all-staff meeting creating speculation that ranged from merger rumors to restructuring fears. But Derek Morrison dressed with particular care because he still believed this might be when his promotion was announced. Vanessa had spent the previous evening at her apartment, their apartment now, analyzing possibilities and angles with the kind of strategic intensity that Derek found attractive but never quite recognized as concerning. The main auditorium filled with employees from every department, the space designed to hold over 500 people, but feeling crowded with anticipation and anxiety, and Derek found a seat in the middle section where senior managers typically congregated, his positioning strategic even in room selection. Vanessa sat several rows back with other administrative staff, but Derek could feel her attention on him, her mind always calculating, always positioning. At 10 a.m. sharp, the lights dimmed, and Robert Carmichael stepped to the podium with the grave authority of a man about to deliver news that would reshape everyone's understanding of their professional reality. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying through the excellent acoustics. "Today's announcement concerns the future of Whitmore Technologies and the resolution of Victor Whitmore's estate." The room held its collective breath, but Derek felt only mild interest because estate matters didn't immediately affect his daily reality or his anticipated promotion. That indifference was about to be shattered. "Victor Whitmore founded this company 40 years ago," Carmichael continued, "and built it into one of the most successful technology firms in the nation. But Victor held secrets that many of you never knew, secrets that he maintained to protect someone he loved, but lacked the courage to publicly acknowledge." The room's attention sharpened, confusion mixing with curiosity, but Derek's expression remained neutral because this still seemed like historical preamble rather than immediate relevance. That would change in approximately 30 seconds. "Victor Whitmore had a daughter," Carmichael announced, and the room erupted in surprised murmurs. 30 years ago, he made the difficult decision to place this daughter for adoption, maintaining her safety and supporting her education through anonymous means while never revealing their relationship publicly. But in his final wishes, Victor corrected this failure by leaving his estate and controlling interest in this company to his daughter, making her the majority shareholder and effective owner of Whitmore Technologies. Derek's interest increased marginally, but he still didn't understand how this could possibly impact him personally. The idea that he might know this mysterious heir, might have been married to her, might have just divorced her, remained completely outside his realm of possibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carmichael said, "I'd like to introduce you to Emma Whitmore, Victor Whitmore's daughter and the new majority owner of this company." The lights came up on the stage, and Emma walked out from the wings, her posture straight, her expression composed, her presence commanding in ways Derek had never seen in all their years of marriage. But it took him a full 3 seconds to recognize her, because his brain couldn't process that the woman on stage and his ex-wife could possibly be the same person. The auditorium exploded in shocked whispers and gasps, but the loudest sound was Derek Morrison's sharp intake of breath As his world tilted violently off its axis, his face went white, then red, then white again as his mind raced through implications like a computer processing catastrophic error codes. Emma, his Emma, the woman he'd divorced 5 days ago, the woman he'd dismissed as unsophisticated and unambitious, the woman who'd supported him through everything. She was the heir. She was the owner. She was his boss's boss's boss. Vanessa's reaction was equally visceral, but more immediately calculated. Derek heard her sharp gasp from several rows back, and when he instinctively turned to look at her, he saw her face cycling through shock, horror, and rapid strategic recalculation as she understood that she had orchestrated Derek's divorce from literally the most powerful person in the building. Emma's voice filled the auditorium, calm and clear and carrying authority that seemed to come from some deep place Derek had never accessed in all their years together. "I know this is shocking," she began, and her eyes swept the room, but didn't linger on Derek, a strategic choice that somehow hurt more than direct confrontation would have. "I've spent the past 30 years not knowing where I came from, not understanding why certain opportunities appeared in my life, and not recognizing that I was being watched over from a distance by someone who cared but lacked courage." The room was silent now, every person hanging on her words, but Derek couldn't hear anything past the rushing in his ears as his entire understanding of his life collapsed and reformed into something unrecognizable. "Victor Whitmore was a complicated man," Emma continued, "and I'm still processing what his choices meant and what his legacy represents. But I'm here today to commit to you that I will learn this business, understand this culture, and work to build something worthy of the trust you've placed in this company." She spoke for another 10 minutes about transition plans, about maintaining stability, about respecting the expertise of the people who'd built Whitmore Technologies into what it was. But Derek didn't process any of it because his mind was stuck in an endless loop of realization. He had divorced the owner of the company. He had left the woman who now controlled his professional destiny. He had thrown away a marriage to someone who could give him everything he'd ever wanted. And he had done it all because Vanessa had convinced him Emma was holding him back. When Emma finished speaking and opened the floor for questions, Derek couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but sit frozen in his seat. While around him, people asked about strategic vision and organizational structure, and all the professional questions that competent employees would ask. But all Derek could think about was that conversation in their apartment 5 days ago, about how he'd told Emma that Vanessa understood ambition in ways she never could, about how he'd celebrated his freedom at an expensive restaurant while Emma had quietly packed her belongings and walked away from a marriage to become the most powerful person in his entire professional world. The meeting concluded with polite applause that Derek mechanically joined, his hands moving of their own accord while his brain remained locked in catastrophic processing mode. People began filing out, conversations bubbling up about the shocking revelation, but Derek sat, paralyzed until someone jostled his shoulder. "Derek, you okay?" It was Paul Chen, a colleague from another department, his expression concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Derek's voice came out strangled. "I need to. I have to." But what did he have to do? Apologize, beg, explain. Every option seemed simultaneously essential and utterly pointless, because no words could possibly bridge the canyon between what he'd done and what he'd only now discovered he'd destroyed. Vanessa appeared at his elbow, her face carefully composed, but her eyes showing calculations that Derek was only now learning to recognize as panic beneath strategic presentation. "We need to talk," she hissed, her hand gripping his arm with intensity that suggested she understood exactly how thoroughly they had both miscalculated. "Now." Derek let himself be pulled from the auditorium, his legs moving automatically while his mind remained several minutes behind, still processing the image of Emma on that stage, speaking with authority he'd never imagined she possessed, while revealing an identity that rewrote their entire history. They ended up in an empty conference room, and Vanessa immediately began pacing with the frantic energy of someone whose carefully constructed plans had just collapsed. "Did you know?" she demanded, her voice sharp with accusation. "Did you have any idea who she was?" "Of course not," Derek's own voice finally returned, but it came out defensive and shrill. "She told me she was an orphan, foster care, community college on grants. How was I supposed to know her father was Victor Whitmore?" "She's the majority shareholder," Vanessa said, still pacing, her mind visibly working through angles and options. "She controls everything. She controls your career. She controls my job. She controls our entire futures, and you just divorced her." "You pushed me to divorce her." Derek's shock was converting to anger, a defensive response to overwhelming guilt. "You said she was holding me back. You said I deserved someone who understood my ambitions." "I didn't know she was secretly a billionaire heiress," Vanessa snapped back, but then she caught herself, her expression smoothing as she deployed the manipulative calm that had worked so effectively on Derek for months. Okay, let's think about this strategically. She announced herself publicly. She's committed to the company. She's going to be focused on big picture issues, not personal grievances. We just need to keep our heads down, do excellent work, and let this blow over. But Derek's mind was elsewhere, replaying conversations with Emma, remembering the way she'd supported him, the way she'd never complained when he spent nights studying for his MBA, the way she'd networked at company events to help his career, and the way she'd quietly accepted the divorce without fighting or pleading or making it difficult. He'd interpreted her grace as weakness, her support as obligation, her quiet strength as lack of ambition. But what if everything he'd believed about Emma was wrong? What if everything he'd valued about Vanessa was hollow? "I need to talk to her," Derek said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Vanessa responded immediately. "That's the worst possible move right now. You need to give her space. Let things settle and approach this professionally, not emotionally." But Derek was already moving toward the door, his mind made up in the way of people who finally understand they've made catastrophic mistakes and become desperate to fix them before the consequences fully materialize. "She was my wife. I need to explain. I need to apologize." "Derek, stop!" Vanessa's voice carried command that had always worked before, but Derek was no longer listening, because for the first time in months, he was seeing clearly, and what he saw was that Vanessa had manipulated him into destroying the most important relationship in his life for her own strategic purposes. He left the conference room despite Vanessa's protests, his mind singularly focused on finding Emma, on explaining that he'd made a mistake, on somehow convincing her that what they'd had was real and could be salvaged despite his betrayal. But as Derek navigated the building toward the executive floor, he didn't yet understand that Emma wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. She was interested in watching what choices Derek would make, now that he understood the cost of his previous choices. Derek reached the executive floor and found himself facing an assistant he'd never met, a professional woman in her 40s who assessed him with the kind of protective evaluation that gatekeepers to power learn to deploy instinctively. "I need to see Emma," Derek said, his voice urgent. "Emma Whitmore, it's important." "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Morrison? Derek Morrison, we were..." But how did he describe what they were? Ex-spouses, former partners, victims of his own terrible judgment? The assistant's expression shifted to something that might have been pity or judgment or both. "Ms. Whitmore is in meetings all day, Mr. Morrison. If you'd like to schedule an appointment, I can check her calendar for availability next week." Next week. The words hit Derek like cold water because they made clear that whatever access he'd once had to Emma through marriage was gone now, replaced by professional hierarchies and executive protocols. "Please," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "just tell her I need to talk to her. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." The assistant studied him for a long moment, then picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it. Derek couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw her expression shift through several complicated emotions before she hung up. "Ms. Whitmore says she'll give you 10 minutes at 6 p.m. today in conference room A. Don't be late." 6 p.m. Derek had 8 hours to figure out what to possibly say to the woman he'd betrayed, dismissed, and divorced, only to discover she'd been secretly powerful beyond his imagination all along. He nodded mechanically and walked back toward his office, but the building felt different now, the familiar corridors and departments transformed by his new understanding that Emma wasn't just somewhere in this ecosystem. She was at the top of it, looking down at everything, including him. The 8 hours between Derek's scheduling of the meeting and 6 p.m. passed with glacial slowness, each minute feeling like an hour as he sat in his office trying to work, but mostly replaying every conversation with Emma, every dismissive comment he'd made, every time he'd compared her unfavorably to Vanessa. His colleagues had heard about the announcement, and several stopped by to express surprise that he'd never mentioned being married to Victor Whitmore's daughter, not understanding that Derek himself had only learned this information hours ago. Vanessa had texted him 17 times, her messages escalating from strategic advice to demands to meet, to accusations that he was about to make things worse, but Derek had silenced his phone because he couldn't deal with her manipulation while trying to process his own catastrophic misjudgment. Around 3 p.m. he'd walked past Vanessa's desk and seen her on the phone, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to someone about opportunities elsewhere and better situations, and Derek had understood with sinking certainty that Vanessa was already planning her exit strategy, calculating her next target, demonstrating exactly the kind of opportunistic character that Emma had possessed the opposite of. At 5:45 p.m., Derek left his office and walked to conference room A with the slow deliberation of someone approaching their own execution. The room was one of the mid-level executive spaces, not ostentatious but professional, with a large table, comfortable chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city lights beginning to emerge in the early evening. Emma was already there, sitting at the head of the table in a tailored suit that Derek had never seen before, her posture straight, her expression neutral, her entire presence radiating a quiet power that Derek now realized had always been there, but he'd been too blind to recognize. "Thank you for seeing me," Derek began, his voice uncertain as he took a seat 3 chairs away, the distance between them suddenly symbolic of everything he'd destroyed. "You asked for 10 minutes, Emma said, her voice professional and cool. "I'm curious what you think you need to say." The directness was jarring, so different from the Emma who'd gently supported him for years, but Derek pushed forward because he'd spent 8 hours convincing himself that he could fix this if he could just explain. "Emma, I had no idea about your father, about who you really were. If you'd known what?" Emma interrupted, her eyes finally meeting his directly. "That I was worth staying married to? That I was worth respecting? That I was worth treating with basic decency instead of abandoning for your secretary?" The words hit like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating, but Derek fumbled forward. "That's not fair. You never told me about your background. You let me believe you were just what, Derek?" Emma's voice remained calm, but underneath Derek could hear something sharp and dangerous. "Just an orphan, just a quiet woman with no connections, just someone who wasn't sophisticated enough for your ambitions." I didn't lie to you. I told you exactly what I believed about my own history, but you took that information and decided I was worth less than someone who could help your career. Vanessa manipulated me, Derek tried, but even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. Vanessa did what Vanessa does, Emma responded. She identified someone she thought she could use and deployed strategies to get what she wanted. But you made every single choice, Derek. You chose to have an affair. You chose to prioritize what Vanessa offered over what we'd built. You chose to file for divorce. And you made all those choices believing I had nothing to offer you except love, support, and partnership. And you decided those things weren't valuable enough. Derek felt tears pricking his eyes, but they were tears of self-pity and shame rather than genuine remorse. And some part of him recognized that even now he was more upset about what he'd lost than about how he'd hurt Emma. I was wrong, he said. I made a terrible mistake. But we had something real once. We loved each other. That has to count for something. It counted for 5 years of my life, Emma said quietly. 5 years of supporting your dreams, while you slowly decided I wasn't good enough for the future you wanted. It counted for me putting you through your MBA, networking for your promotions, managing our household so you could focus on your career. It counted for me believing we were partners, but then you decided it didn't count for enough, and you threw it away. Not because I betrayed you, not because I failed you, but because Vanessa made you feel more important than I did, and you valued that feeling more than you valued our marriage. I can change, Derek said desperately. I can be better. We can start over. You know me, Emma. You know I'm not a bad person. I just got lost. Emma was silent for a long moment, studying Derek with an expression he couldn't quite read. But when she finally spoke, her words carried a finality that Derek had been dreading. You're not a bad person, Derek. You're a weak one. You're someone who values image over substance, feeling over commitment, and convenience over integrity. And you're right that I know you. I know you better than you've ever known yourself. That's why I know that what you're feeling right now isn't remorse about hurting me. It's panic about the consequences to yourself. That's not true, Derek protested, but his voice lacked conviction because Emma's assessment was accurate in ways he couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge. You filed for divorce 5 days ago, Emma continued, her voice steady but carrying weight. 5 days, Derek. You celebrated at an expensive restaurant. You moved in with Vanessa. You texted her about your future together while I packed my belongings. And in all that time, you never once reached out to ask if I was okay, to acknowledge what you were destroying, or to show any concern for anything except your own happiness. But now, after you discover who I really am and what I'm worth, suddenly you want to reconcile. Suddenly our marriage was valuable. Suddenly you remember that you loved me. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but no words came because every defense he could offer would only prove Emma's point more thoroughly. I gave you access to the most important parts of my life, Emma said. My time, my energy, my support, my love. And you took all of it for granted because you thought I had nothing else to offer. You thought I was just a quiet woman with no ambitions and no value beyond what I could do for you. But the truth is, Derek, I always had more to offer. You just never bothered to see it because you were too busy measuring my worth by standards that had nothing to do with actual value. What do you want me to say? Derek's desperation was transforming into defensive anger, a last refuge for people confronting their own moral failures. That I'm sorry that I was wrong. What else is there? There's the truth, Emma said simply. The truth is that if I had announced my identity before you filed for divorce, you never would have left me. You would have stayed because I was suddenly valuable by your standards. But that wouldn't have been love, Derek. That would have been opportunism. And that's exactly what Vanessa offered you. She saw your value as a rising corporate prospect, and positioned herself accordingly. You two are actually perfectly matched. The observation was clinical and devastating, and Derek felt something breaking inside him that he suspected was his last defense against understanding the full scope of his moral failure. "So that's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our marriage, our history, everything we had, none of it matters." "It mattered," Emma corrected gently. "It mattered very much. But you're the one who decided it didn't matter enough." "You made that choice, Derek, not me, not Vanessa. You, and now you have to live with the consequences of that choice." "What consequences?" Derek asked, and immediately regretted the question, because it revealed that even now he was still focused on what this meant for him, rather than what he'd done to Emma. Emma stood, signaling that their conversation was ending, but her expression carried something that looked almost like sympathy. "The consequence isn't revenge, Derek. It's reality. You're a competent project manager. You do good work. You'll continue to have a job here as long as you perform well and behave ethically. But your promotion isn't happening. Not because I'm punishing you, but because the people who promoted you into positions you weren't quite ready for did so partly because I advocated for you, networked for you, and created opportunities for you. Without that support, you're going to advance based on your actual merit, rather than on the connections and advocacy I provided." Derek felt the ground dropping out beneath him as he understood that his entire career trajectory had been shaped by Emma's quiet support he'd taken for granted while attributing his success to his own capabilities. "You're sabotaging my career," he said, but it came out weak because he knew that wasn't what Emma was doing. "I'm withdrawing my advocacy," Emma corrected. "There's a difference. You'll succeed or fail based on what you actually bring to this company, not on what your wife brings on your behalf. That's not sabotage. That's just the natural consequence of divorce." She moved toward the door, but Derek wasn't quite ready to let this end. "What about Vanessa?" he asked. "What are you going to do about her?" Emma paused at the door, her back to Derek, and when she spoke, her voice carried a complexity that Derek was only beginning to understand. "Vanessa is remarkably good at her job when she's not busy manipulating people. She'll have the opportunity to prove whether she wants to be known for her competence or her strategic relationships. That's her choice, not mine." "You're giving her a chance?" Derek couldn't hide his surprise. "I'm giving everyone a chance to show who they really are," Emma said, finally turning back to face him. "Including you, Derek. You can choose to learn from this, to become someone who values people for who they are rather than what they can do for you. Or you can remain who you've been, someone who measures worth by status and advantage. But either way, you'll live with the consequences of who you choose to be." With that, Emma left, and Derek sat alone in the conference room as darkness fell outside the windows and inside his own understanding of who he was and what he'd done. He had come to this meeting hoping to fix his mistake, to somehow reclaim what he'd thrown away, but what he'd learned instead was that Emma had never been his to reclaim because he'd never truly valued her as a complete person, only as a supporting character in his own narrative of success. The worst part, Derek was beginning to realize, wasn't that he'd lost Emma's wealth or power or connections. The worst part was that he'd lost someone who had genuinely loved him, who had supported him without expecting recognition, who had been exactly the kind of partner everyone claimed they wanted but few people actually valued when they had it. And he'd lost her not because she hadn't been enough, but because he hadn't been and might never be the kind of person who deserved what she'd offered. The weeks following Emma's announcement transformed Whitmore Technologies in ways subtle and profound, the culture shifting as people recalibrated their understanding of power, value, and integrity under leadership that prioritized substance over appearance. Emma threw herself into understanding the company, spending time in every department, asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and her genuine interest in the people who made the organization function. Her approach was neither revolutionary nor vindictive. It was simply honest, and that honesty created ripple effects throughout the system. For Derek, those weeks were a study in uncomfortable revelation as he watched from a distance, while Emma built relationships with executives and employees alike, her natural integrity and intelligence earning respect that had nothing to do with her wealth or ownership, and everything to do with who she actually was. The promotion Derek had expected never materialized, but neither did any overt punishment. He simply found himself evaluated based on his actual performance rather than on connections he no longer possessed. And that evaluation revealed him to be exactly what Emma had suggested: competent but not exceptional, capable but not extraordinary. The hardest part wasn't the professional stagnation, but the social revelation as Derek watched colleagues who'd respected him begin to subtly shift their attitudes once they understood the full story of his divorce. The details had leaked gradually, not from Emma, who maintained complete discretion, but from people who'd been at that final meeting, who'd seen Derek's face when Emma was announced, who'd pieced together the timeline of his affair with Vanessa and his divorce from a woman he'd only later discovered was the company's owner. Corporate social structures are remarkably sensitive to moral calculations, and Derek found himself increasingly isolated, not through any official action but through the natural consequences of people choosing not to associate with someone who demonstrated such profound misjudgment and opportunism. Vanessa's trajectory proved even more instructive. She'd spent the first week after Emma's announcement in a state of strategic panic, updating her resume, reaching out to contacts, positioning herself for an exit that would minimize damage to her carefully cultivated professional image. But then something unexpected happened. Emma had called Vanessa to her office for a conversation that Vanessa had anticipated would end with her termination, but instead had ended with an offer. "You're skilled at understanding systems and positioning within them," Emma had told Vanessa, her voice carrying neither judgment nor warmth, just professional assessment. "The question is whether you want to be known for manipulating those systems or for contributing to them. If it's the latter, you have an opportunity here. If it's the former, you should probably find somewhere else to deploy those skills." Vanessa, to her credit or her continued strategic calculation, had chosen to stay, but she'd also withdrawn from her relationship with Derek with ruthless efficiency once she'd recognized that his value had plummeted while his complications had increased. Derek had watched this unfold with a growing understanding that Vanessa had never cared about him as a person, only as a vehicle for her own advancement, and that recognition forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about why he'd found her attractive in the first place. Emma, meanwhile, was discovering aspects of her father's legacy that complicated her feelings about her inheritance in ways she hadn't anticipated. Victor Whitmore had indeed watched over her from a distance, ensuring opportunities without revealing himself, but he'd also built a company that sometimes prioritized profit over people, growth over ethics, and appearance over substance. Emma found herself in the position of inheriting not just wealth, but responsibility for systems that didn't always align with her values, and she attacked that challenge with the same quiet determination she'd brought to supporting Derek's career, except now she was supporting something larger and potentially more meaningful. She restructured the performance review system to emphasize contribution over connection, merit over manipulation. She implemented transparency measures in promotion decisions that made it harder for people like Vanessa to advance through strategic relationships rather than actual competence. She established programs for employees in situations similar to her own past. People with talent but without obvious connections, or advocates who might otherwise be overlooked by systems that rewarded visibility over capability. The changes weren't dramatic or revolutionary, but they were significant, and they gradually transformed Whitmore Technology's culture from one that tacitly accepted political maneuvering to one that increasingly valued integrity and substance. Some people left, including several executives who'd thrived under the previous system, but many more stayed and thrived under leadership that recognized them for what they contributed, rather than who they knew. Derek watched all this from his position of competent mediocrity, no longer rising but not exactly falling either, just existing in the middle of the pack where his actual capabilities placed him. The hardest moments came when he'd see Emma in the cafeteria or the hallways. Her presence never quite comfortable but never overtly hostile either, as she treated him with the same professional courtesy she extended to all employees. Nothing more, nothing less. The complete absence of special consideration somehow more painful than active antagonism would have been. One evening, approximately 2 months after Emma's announcement, Derek found himself working late on a project deadline, and he encountered Emma in the building's lobby as she was leaving. For a moment, they stood in the kind of awkward proximity that former intimates sometimes experience, neither quite sure what acknowledgement was appropriate or expected. "Derek?" Emma said simply, her tone neutral. "Emma," Derek replied, then found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "I've been watching what you're doing here. The changes you're implementing. They're good. They're right." Emma studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said, but didn't elaborate or invite further conversation. Derek knew he should let this go, should accept the professional boundaries Emma had established, but something pushed him to continue. "I understand now," he said quietly, "what you were trying to tell me in that conference room about value and worth and measuring people by the wrong standards. I understand it now." "Do you?" Emma's question wasn't mocking, just genuinely curious. "I think so," Derek said, though his voice carried uncertainty. "I spent our entire marriage focused on becoming someone important by standards that didn't actually matter. Position, status, perception. And I failed to recognize that you were already someone important, not because of who your father was, but because of who you were, your integrity, your support, your actual character. I measured you by categories that had nothing to do with your real value, and I lost something irreplaceable because I was too blind to see what actually mattered." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried something softer than the professional distance she'd maintained. "That's closer to understanding than you've gotten before," she said. "But Derek, the real question isn't whether you understand what you lost with me. It's whether you understand what you lost in yourself, the person you could have been if you'd valued the right things, if you'd built your life on substance instead of appearance, if you'd been someone who measured worth by actual character, rather than by what people could do for you." The observation hit Derek with the force of revelation because Emma was right. His regret had been primarily about losing her, about what he'd sacrificed, about what he no longer had access to, but he hadn't spent nearly enough time considering the person he'd become in making those choices, the moral compromises he'd accepted, the character he'd failed to build while chasing external validation and status. "I don't know if I can become that person now," Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The person I should have been. I don't know if I have that kind of strength or integrity." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since the divorce," Emma responded, "and that honesty is actually a foundation you could build on, if you choose to. But Derek, you have to understand that becoming better isn't about winning me back or fixing what we had. That's over. It's about deciding what kind of person you want to be for the rest of your life, regardless of external consequences or rewards. With that, Emma walked toward the exit, pausing only once to look back. "I hope you figure it out," she said. "Not for my sake, I've moved on, but for yours, because everyone deserves the chance to become someone they can actually respect when they look in the mirror." Then she was gone, and Derek stood in the empty lobby processing the gift Emma had just given him. Not forgiveness, which he didn't deserve, and not reconciliation, which wasn't possible, but something potentially more valuable, the honest reflection of who he'd become and the possibility, however difficult, of choosing differently going forward. The conference room overlooked the city from Whitmore Technologies' executive floor, sunlight streaming through windows that offered a view of transformation both literal and metaphorical. Emma Whitmore sat at the head of the table, now 32 years old, and fully settled into leadership of a company that had grown under her guidance from $12 billion to $16 billion in valuation, not through aggressive acquisition or questionable practices, but through steady innovation and a culture shift that had attracted top talent who wanted to work somewhere that valued integrity alongside ambition. She was reviewing the annual performance evaluations when Margaret Torres, now Emma's CFO and closest professional confidant, knocked and entered with a tablet. "The promotion recommendations are ready for your final approval," Margaret said, settling into a chair. "Some interesting names this year." Emma scanned the list, her practiced eye noting patterns and trajectories, and she paused at one name in particular. "Derek Morrison," she read aloud, "recommended for promotion to Director of Project Integration by James Kirkland, no less." Margaret nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Morrison's work the past 18 months has been exceptional. He completed the Midwest restructuring project ahead of schedule and under budget. He's mentored 3 junior managers who've all advanced. He's been transparent about mistakes, generous with credit, and has actually turned down 2 opportunities that would have advanced him faster because he said he wanted to be certain he was ready before taking on more responsibility. Emma studied the detailed performance notes, and they told a story of someone who'd done something remarkable. He'd chosen to change, not dramatically or all at once, but gradually and genuinely, building a reputation based on actual contribution rather than on perception or positioning. "What's your recommendation?" Emma asked, though she'd already made her decision. "Approve it," Margaret said without hesitation. "He's earned it. And Emma, for what it's worth, he's never once tried to leverage your past relationship. He's never mentioned it in professional contexts. He's never sought special consideration. He's just done the work." Emma nodded slowly, recognizing the significance of Derek's choices, the discipline it must have taken to rebuild a reputation while working for a company owned by his ex-wife, the character required to advance based solely on merit, while knowing that any hint of leveraging personal history would destroy everything he'd built. "Approved," she said, signing off on Derek's promotion along with several others. "And Margaret, make sure his promotion announcement emphasizes his specific contributions. He's earned recognition for what he actually did, not for managing a complicated situation with grace." After Margaret left, Emma stood at the windows looking out at the city, her mind wandering to paths taken and not taken, to the woman she'd been 2 years ago, devastated by divorce but unknowingly on the threshold of transformation, and the woman she'd become. She'd dated occasionally, though nothing serious, her focus primarily on building something meaningful with her father's legacy, rather than on replacing what Derek had represented. The $350 million inheritance that had seemed so enormous initially had become a tool for change. Scholarship programs for students from foster care, funding for organizations supporting women in technology, investments in companies prioritizing ethics alongside profits. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa Hartley, now working in a completely different department as a strategic operations analyst, a role that utilized her skills at understanding systems without requiring the interpersonal manipulation that had characterized her earlier career. Vanessa had indeed chosen competence over connection, and while she and Emma would never be friends, they'd developed a mutual professional respect built on honest assessment rather than on pretense or history. The text was simple. Saw Morrison's promotion announcement. Well deserved. Progress looks different for everyone, but it's real when it's earned. Emma smiled slightly at Vanessa's observation, recognizing that Vanessa too had chosen a different path, one that suggested people could indeed change when consequences forced honest self-assessment. She didn't respond to the text. Some communications required acknowledgement through action rather than words, but she appreciated the recognition of what Derek's journey represented. That evening, Emma left the office at a reasonable hour, one of the benefits of building a culture that didn't worship overwork, and drove to a small restaurant where she was meeting with a group of young professionals from her scholarship program. These gatherings had become monthly traditions, opportunities to mentor people facing challenges similar to those she'd once faced, chances to provide the kind of direct support that Victor Whitmore had never quite managed to offer her. As she listened to scholarship recipients discuss their goals, challenges, and aspirations, Emma found herself thinking about inheritance in its fullest sense, not just the money and company she'd received, but the responsibilities, complications, and opportunities that came with power and resources. She'd inherited her father's wealth, but she was choosing to build her own legacy, one that prioritized presence over distance, transparency over secrecy, and the kind of courage that Victor Whitmore had struggled to manifest. Later that night, in the comfortable townhouse she'd purchased in a quiet neighborhood, far from the luxury enclave where she could have easily afforded to live, Emma sat on her couch with a cup of tea and allowed herself to reflect on the past 2 years. She'd gained wealth and power beyond imagination, but she'd also gained something more valuable, the clarity to recognize that her worth had never been determined by external validation, that her value wasn't measured by Derek's recognition of it, and that the quiet strength she'd always possessed was exactly the foundation she'd needed to build something meaningful. She thought about Derek occasionally, with neither bitterness nor longing, but with a kind of philosophical curiosity about how people change or don't change when faced with the consequences of their choices. His promotion represented real growth, but it also represented the natural outcome of choosing differently, not because Emma had orchestrated some revenge or reward, but because systems built on merit ultimately reflected the actual character and capability people brought to them. Emma's phone buzzed again, this time with an email from Robert Carmichael, who'd remained her attorney and advisor through the transition. The message contained estate documents from another client, a reminder that Emma's story of hidden inheritance and revealed identity wasn't unique. Families held secrets, power, complicated relationships, and people often failed to see value until circumstances forced them to recognize it. But Emma's response to her circumstances had been uniquely hers. She'd chosen honesty over manipulation, integrity over revenge, and building something meaningful over destroying those who'd hurt her. That choice hadn't made her weak or foolish. It had made her powerful in ways that transcended wealth or corporate control. Powerful in the sense that she'd maintained her own character while refusing to let others' failures diminish her values. As she prepared for bed that night, Emma caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw someone different from the woman Derek had dismissed 2 years ago. not because her external appearance had dramatically changed, but because she now carried herself with the confidence of someone who understood their own worth, independent of anyone else's assessment. She was Emma Whitmore, daughter of a trillionaire and inheritor of an empire, yes, but more importantly, she was someone who'd chosen to build something better than what she'd inherited, someone who'd transformed hurt into purpose and betrayal into clarity about what actually mattered. The question of what Derek learned from their story, what Vanessa learned, what others who heard about Emma's journey might learn, those remained open questions that each person would answer through their own choices. But Emma had learned what she needed to learn, that value isn't determined by others' ability to recognize it, that power is most meaningful when used to build rather than destroy, and that sometimes the greatest gift a person can give themselves is the clarity to see who they actually are rather than who others tried to convince them they should be. And that understanding, Emma realized, as she turned off the lights and settled into the comfortable bed in her modest townhouse that she'd chosen, despite being able to afford mansions. That understanding was worth more than $350 million, more than controlling interest in a $12 billion company, more than all the external markers of success that people like Derek had spent their lives chasing, because Emma had something that couldn't be inherited or purchased or taken away by anyone else's choices. She had herself, completely and honestly, and that was ultimately the only inheritance that truly mattered. The story of Derek and Emma didn't end with reconciliation or revenge, but with something more realistic and perhaps more powerful. It ended with both of them continuing forward as different people than they'd been. Derek slowly building a character based on earned integrity rather than manipulated perception, and Emma building a legacy that honored both where she'd come from and who she'd chosen to become. And in the end, that divergence, Derek finally learning what actual value meant while Emma demonstrated it, was exactly the ending their story needed. Not for dramatic satisfaction, but for honest resolution about how people change, grow, and ultimately determine through their own choices what their lives will mean and who they'll become.
It's 3 a.m. Police lights are flashing across a quiet suburban street, cutting through the darkness like strobes of panic. A woman stands on her porch, her hand trembling as she holds her daughter close. The little girl, no more than 8 years old, clutches a stuffed doll against her chest. Her voice is small, almost a whisper, but every word cuts through the night air like a knife. "Ma, that's the man who followed me home, and he said he knows where Daddy is." Across the lawn, standing under the pale glow of a street lamp, a man raises his hands slowly. His face is shadowed, but his voice is steady, urgent. "I didn't mean to scare her, but if you want to see your husband alive, we need to talk." The mother's breath catches. Her world tilts, and in that moment, nothing will ever be the same again. What happened over the next 48 hours would expose secrets this family never knew existed, and unravel the truth behind a disappearance no one was prepared for. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Tease the questions. Why didn't the father come home that night? Why was a stranger following an 8-year-old girl through the streets? What does he know? Who is he really? And most importantly, what kind of danger has this family been living in without even knowing it? To understand what really happened, we need to go back 24 hours. Back to the moment everything began to fall apart. Back to a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, when a loving father kissed his daughter goodbye, told his wife he'd be home for dinner, and walked out the door for the last time. At least, that's what everyone thought. Her name is Amara Hill. She's 42 years old, works the night shift at a medical center downtown, and has been married to Daniel Hill for 12 years. They met at a community center where Daniel was volunteering to teach electrical work to at-risk youth. Amara was there coordinating a health fair. She remembers the first time she saw him, The way he patiently explained circuits to a teenager who couldn't sit still. The way he never raised his voice, never lost his patience. That's who Daniel was. Steady, reliable. The kind of man who showed up. Their daughter, Lani, is 8 years old. She has her father's eyes and her mother's sharp memory. She notices everything. The way her father checks the rearview mirror twice when he drives. The way he pauses before answering phone calls. The way he sometimes stares out the window like he's watching for something that hasn't arrived yet. But she's a child, so she doesn't ask. She just watches. And she remembers. Daniel Hill is 45. He's an electrician, respected in his field, known for showing up early and staying late. His co-workers describe him as quiet but dependable. He doesn't talk much about his personal life. He doesn't go out for drinks after work. He goes home. Always. That's why when he didn't come home on that Tuesday night, Amara knew something was wrong. Not maybe wrong. Not possibly wrong. Wrong. Because Daniel didn't break promises. Especially not to Lani. And he had promised her he'd help with her science project that night. The one about circuits. The one she'd been excited about all week. When Amara came home from her shift at 6 in the morning and found Lani asleep on the couch, the project materials still spread across the kitchen table untouched. Her stomach dropped. She checked his side of the bed. Not slept in. She called his phone. Straight to voicemail. She texted. Nothing. And that's when Lani woke up, rubbing her eyes, looking around the room with that confused, hopeful expression children get when they're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Ma. My daddy didn't come home last night. Those 8 words changed everything. Amara tried to keep her voice steady. He probably got called to an emergency job, baby. You know how that goes sometimes. But Lani just stared at her. And Amara could see it in her daughter's eyes. She didn't believe it either. By noon, Amara had called Daniel's supervisor. He told her Daniel had clocked out at 4:30 the previous afternoon. Said he had an urgent errand to run. Never said what, never said where. That wasn't like him. Daniel always communicated, always let someone know where he was going. One of his co-workers, a man named Jerome, pulled Amara aside in the parking lot. He looked around like he was checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned in close and said, "He looked scared yesterday. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just nodded, but his hands were shaking." Amara felt her chest tighten. Scared of what? Jerome shook his head. I don't know. But whatever it wasn't small. That evening, Amara picked Lani up from school, like always. They walked the same route they always walked. 3 blocks down Maple Street. Turn left on Oakwood, then home. But halfway down Oakwood, Lani tugged on her mother's sleeve. Ma, that man is following us. Amara turned. There was a man about 20 feet behind them. Hooded jacket. Hands in his pockets. Walking at the same pace. When Amara stopped, he stopped. When she started walking again, so did he. She picked up Lani and walked faster. The man didn't run. He just kept pace. By the time they reached their front door, he was gone. But the feeling stayed. That cold, creeping certainty that someone was watching. That night, Amara locked every door. Every window. She kept the lights on. She didn't sleep. And at 2:30 in the morning, she saw him again, standing under the street lamp across from their house. Just standing there, watching. She called the police. When the officers arrived, the man didn't run. He raised his hands slowly and started walking toward them. Amara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to identify yourself." The man's voice was calm. Too calm. "My name is Colin Reed. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because Daniel Hill is in danger, and if his family doesn't know what's going on, they're in danger too." Amara felt the ground shift beneath her. "What are you talking about? Where is my husband?" Colin looked at her with something that might have been pity. "I don't know where he is right now. But I know why he disappeared, and I know who's looking for him." The officer cut in. "You need to come down to the station and make a statement." Colin nodded. But before he got into the police car, he looked back at Amara. Check his toolbox, the one he keeps in the garage. There's something in there he didn't want you to find. But you need to see it now." Amara didn't wait for the police to leave. She went straight to the garage. Daniel's red toolbox sat on the workbench, exactly where it always was. She opened it. Wrenches, screwdrivers, electrical tape. Nothing unusual. But then she lifted the top tray. Underneath, tucked into the corner, was a torn photograph. It showed a woman's hand, fingers wrapped around a baby's tiny fist. The baby was wearing a hospital bracelet. The photo was old, creased, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. Amara didn't recognize the hand, didn't recognize the bracelet, and on the back, written in faded ink, were 3 words: "I'm so sorry." Her hands started shaking. Who was this woman? Whose baby was that? And why had Daniel been carrying this photo like a secret he couldn't let go of? The next morning, she went to see Daniel's best friend, a man named Terrence, who had known him since high school. Terrence lived in a small apartment across town. When he opened the door and saw Amara standing there, his face went pale. "Amara, I didn't think you'd come here." "Where is he, Terrence?" He hesitated. Then he stepped aside and let her in. They sat in his cramped living room, and for a long time he didn't say anything. Finally, he spoke. Daniel was in trouble. Not the kind you can talk your way out of. Not the kind the police can help with. "What kind of trouble?" Terrence rubbed his face. "There are people, dangerous people, and Daniel got involved in something he thought was right. He was trying to help someone, but it went bad, real bad, and now they're looking for him." Amara's voice cracked. Who's looking for him?" Terrence stood up, walked to the window, looked out like he expected someone to be there. "I can't tell you that, because if I do, they'll come after you next, and I can't have that on my conscience." Then he turned to her, and his eyes were filled with something Amara had never seen in him before. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. If they find him, Amara, they're not going to just hurt him. They're going to make an example out of him, and anyone close to him. Amara went to the police, filed a missing persons report, showed them the photograph, told them about Colin Reed, told them about Terrence's warning. The officer behind the desk looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Ma'am, adults go missing all the time. Most of them come back. Give it a few more days." A few more days. Like Daniel was on vacation. Like he'd just decided to disappear and leave his family behind without a word. Amara wanted to scream, but she didn't. She thanked the officer, and she left, because she realized something in that moment. No one was going to help her. If she wanted to find Daniel, she was going to have to do it herself. She started with the photograph. She took it to a photo lab and asked them to enhance it, to see if there was any identifying information. The technician pointed out a small logo on the hospital bracelet. It was from Mercy General, a hospital on the east side of the city. Amara drove there that same afternoon. She asked to speak to someone in records. After an hour of waiting, a nurse finally agreed to help her. But when Amara showed her the photograph, the nurse's expression changed. "Where did you get this?" "It belonged to my husband. Please. I just need to know who this baby is." The nurse looked around. Then she leaned in close. "This bracelet is from 8 years ago. The baby's name was Joshua. His mother's name was Natalie Brooks. She died 3 months ago." Amara's breath caught. "How?" The nurse hesitated. "Overdose. At least that's what the report said. But there were people who didn't believe it. People who said she was trying to get out of a bad situation, and someone made sure she didn't." Amara felt like the room was spinning. 8 years ago. That was the same year Lonnie was born. The same year Daniel started working late. The same year he started looking over his shoulder. She drove to the address the nurse had given her. It was a run-down apartment building in a part of town Amara rarely visited. The paint was peeling. The hallways smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. She knocked on the door of apartment 212. A woman answered. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and a baby on her hip. "Can I help you?" Amara showed her the photograph. Did you know, Natalie Brooks? The woman's face went pale. Who's asking? My husband knew her. His name is Daniel Hill. He's missing, and I'm trying to understand why. The woman looked down the hallway. Then, she stepped aside. You better come in. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. The woman introduced herself as Kiara. She sat down and bounced the baby on her knee. Natalie was my friend. She was trying to get away from some bad people. Really bad. And your husband. He helped her. He gave her money. Helped her find a safe place to stay. He didn't have to, but he did. Why? Kiara looked at Amara, like the answer should be obvious. Because he was a good man. Because he saw what was happening to her, and he couldn't just walk away. What happened to her? Kiara's voice dropped. They found her, and they made sure she couldn't talk. And now, if your husband was helping her, if he knew too much, they're going to do the same thing to him. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph, trying to piece together a life she didn't know her husband had been living, trying to understand how the man who kissed her every morning, who read bedtime stories to their daughter, who fixed broken things for neighbors without asking for payment, how that man had been hiding something this big. And then her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello? The voice on the other end was cold, emotionless. You've been asking a lot of questions, Mrs. Hill. That's not smart. Her blood ran cold. Who is this? Someone who wants the same thing you do. I want to find your husband. But, unlike you, when I find him, I'm not bringing him home. I'm making sure he pays for what he took. I don't know what you're talking about. The voice laughed. It was a horrible sound. Your husband stole something from people who don't forgive. If he doesn't return it, you and your daughter are going to pay the price. You have 48 hours. The line went dead. Amara sat there, phone still pressed to her ear, hands shaking, heart racing. And for the first time since Daniel disappeared, she felt true, paralyzing fear. The next morning, Colin Reed showed up at her door. No police this time. Just him. Amara almost didn't let him in, but he looked desperate. Please, just give me 5 minutes. She let him in. They sat in the living room, and Lonnie watched from the hallway, half hidden behind the wall. Colin leaned forward, hands clasped. I know you don't trust me. I get it. But I need you to listen. Your husband was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to protect women who had no one else to protect them. Women who were being exploited, trafficked, hurt, and he got too close. He found evidence. Names, locations, money trails, and he took it. He was going to turn it over to the FBI, but before he could, they found out. Amara's voice was barely a whisper. Who are they? People with money, people with power, people who have been operating in this city for years without anyone touching them, and your husband was about to blow it all open. So where is he? Colin's jaw tightened. I don't know, but I think he's hiding, and I think he's trying to keep them away from you. That's why he left. That's why he didn't tell you, because if they thought you knew something, they'd come after you to get to him. Amara felt tears burning behind her eyes. He should have trusted me. He was trying to protect you. By leaving us alone? By making us targets? Colin didn't have an answer for that. And that silence said everything. Later that day, Amara received a text from an unknown number. It was an address, nothing else. Just an address. She knew it was a trap. She knew it was dangerous. But she also knew she was out of options. She dropped Lonnie off at her mother's house and drove to the address. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where bad things happen and no one hears you scream. She parked a block away and walked. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled like rust and decay. And in the center of the room, tied to a chair, was Daniel. He was bruised, bloodied, but alive. Daniel! She ran toward him. But before she reached him, someone stepped out of the shadows. A man, tall, calm, holding a gun. Mrs. Hill. I was hoping you'd come. Amara froze. Let him go. The man smiled. I will. As soon as he tells me where he hid what he stole. But he seems to think protecting strangers is more important than protecting his own family. Maybe you can convince him otherwise. He walked over to Daniel and pressed the gun to his temple. You have 10 seconds. Where is it? Daniel looked at Amara. His eyes were filled with pain, with regret, with love, and he said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And then the door exploded open. Colin Reed came through that door like a storm. He wasn't alone. There were 2 other men with him. They moved fast. Professional. One of them tackled the man with the gun. Another grabbed Amara and pulled her back. Colin cut the ropes binding Daniel. We need to move. Now. They ran. Out the back. Into a waiting van. Amara held Daniel as they sped away, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. What is happening? Who are these people? Colin turned from the front seat. These are people who've been trying to stop the same organization your husband was investigating. We've been working undercover for months, but we didn't know Daniel was involved until it was almost too late. Daniel coughed. His voice was weak. I couldn't just stand by. I saw what they were doing. I saw the women, the children. I had to do something. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw a man she didn't fully know. A man who had carried the weight of other people's suffering without telling her, without asking for help. You should have told me. I was trying to keep you safe. You left us vulnerable. You left us in the dark. That's not protecting us. That's abandoning us. The words hung in the air, and Daniel had no answer, because deep down, he knew she was right. They drove to a safe house on the other side of the city, a small apartment, clean, secure. Colin explained that they had been gathering evidence for months, that Daniel's information was the final piece they needed. But now, the organization knew they were close, and they were going to do whatever it took to stop the truth from coming out. We need Daniel to testify. We need him to hand over the evidence, and then we can protect you. All of you. Amara looked at Colin. And what happens if he doesn't? Colin didn't sugarcoat it. Then, they'll keep coming. And eventually, they'll win. That night, while Daniel slept, Amara sat by the window and watched the street below. She thought about the life they'd built, the quiet mornings, the family dinners, the bedtime stories, and she realized that all of it had been built on a foundation of secrets. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was heartbroken, because the man she loved had been fighting a war she didn't even know existed, and he'd been losing. The next morning, everything changed again. Amara got a call from her mother. Lonnie's gone. Amara's blood turned to ice. What do you mean she's gone? I put her down for a nap. When I checked on her, the window was open. She's gone, Amara. Someone took her. The phone slipped from Amara's hand. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but scream. Daniel was on his feet instantly. What happened? They took her. They took Lonnie. And in that moment, everything else fell away. The evidence, the investigation, the danger, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting their daughter back. Colin was already on the phone, calling his contacts, pulling strings. We'll find her, I promise. But Amara wasn't listening. She was already out the door. The next 6 hours were the longest of Amara's life. Colin's team traced Lonnie's location to a house on the edge of town. The same people who had Daniel. The same people who had been operating in the shadows for years. This was their final move. Their endgame. Amara wanted to go in. Wanted to kick down the door herself. But Colin stopped her. If you go in there, they'll kill her. Let us do this. She's my daughter. I know. And that's why you need to trust me. She didn't want to. But she did. Because she had no other choice. Colin's team moved in at dawn. Fast, silent, efficient. They breached the house, secured the targets, and in a back bedroom, huddled in the corner, was Lonnie. She was scared, but she was alive. When Amara ran into that room and scooped her daughter into her arms, she felt something break inside her. All the fear, all the anger, all the pain. It poured out in sobs she couldn't control. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're safe." Lonnie clung to her. "I knew you'd come, Ma. I knew you'd find me." Daniel was there too. He wrapped his arms around both of them, and for the first time in days, they were together. Broken, but together. The organization was dismantled. Arrests were made. Daniel's testimony, combined with the evidence he'd gathered, was enough to bring down people who had operated with impunity for years. Women who had been trapped were freed. Children who had been exploited were rescued. And the city that had turned a blind eye for so long finally had to face the truth. But for Amara and Daniel, the victory felt hollow, because the cost had been too high. Their daughter had been terrorized. Their family had been torn apart, and the trust they'd built over 12 years had been shattered. It would take time to rebuild. Maybe years, maybe forever. But they were willing to try, because that's what family does. They fight, they forgive, and they find a way forward, even when the road is broken, even when the scars are deep. 6 months later, Amara and Daniel sat on their porch. Lonnie was inside, working on a new science project. This time, Daniel was helping her. This time, he was present. Amara looked at him. "Do you regret it? Helping those women?" Daniel thought about it. "No. I regret how I did it. I regret not trusting you, not telling you the truth. But I don't regret trying to help." Amara nodded. "I understand why you did it. But I need you to understand something too. You weren't protecting me by keeping me in the dark. You were protecting yourself. From having to explain. From having to face the hard conversations. And that almost cost us everything." Daniel reached for her hand. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that you can trust me. That we're in this together. No more secrets." Amara squeezed his hand. "No more secrets." It wasn't a happy ending. Not really. It was something more complicated. More real. It was a new beginning. Built on honesty. On hard-won trust. On the understanding that love isn't just about the good times. It's about facing the darkness together. And choosing each other. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Stories about family aren't just about love. They're also about secrets, forgiveness, courage, and sacrifice. Sometimes the people we think we've lost were fighting to protect us all along. And sometimes, the only way to save the people we love is to let them see who we really are. Flaws and all. Scars and all. Truth and all. What would you have done in Amara's shoes? Do you believe Daniel should have told her earlier, or was he protecting her the only way he knew how? If you were in Daniel's position, would you have taken the same risk? And how would you rebuild trust after something like this? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe. We have more powerful stories coming that you won't want to miss.